After World War I, Germany was a bitter and sad country, a country who wanted revenge and needed a leader who would get that sweet revenge. The Treaty of Versailles took land, money, and soldiers away from Germany. So the German people needed a leader who was going to get all of that back. Hitler was the perfect option. Hitler would be elected by the people, and immediately changes would be made. New currencies, conscription, new air force, and a whole lot of more things in only a few years. Britain and France wouldn't like this since this broke some of the treaty rules, but still, they did nothing about it. Hitler would begin to hire new scientists, getting rid of the old technology companies, researching new things like panzers, U-boats, and spyware. Hitler would become so overwhelmingly popular that millions of young men would join the army, Hitler's propaganda doing very well. The economy would skyrocket from its broken position, people in Germany would not be starving anymore, and inflation would go down rapidly. Of course, we're still talking about Hitler, so let's not make everything seem great. Hitler would make Jews wear a pin everywhere they go, and would speak about his hatred for them, creating mass discrimination and segregation. But still, after seeing that, Italy would decide to become allies with the Germans. After World War I, Italy was met with a bittersweet win. Although yes, they did win the war and gain some land, they did not get all they were promised. And because of the war, their economy was doing very bad. It was not a good trade. And like the Germans, the Italian people would be in favor of a new fascist leader, Mussolini being the best option. With help of Germany, Italy would begin to rapidly rebuild its industry and economy. But instead of focusing on their army like the Germans, Italy would focus more on their navy, Mussolini starting his plan to rule the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Germany would look for new allies. Hungary, Turkey, and Spain would all be interested, but would soon deny joining the alliance after being pressured by the Allies. So for now, it was only these two. For a good 5 years, Hitler had been preparing and advancing his army, and now it was finally time to use it. With over 500,000 men, Hitler marched into Austria and annexed it, with no resistance. Next, he demanded a part of Czechoslovakia with a lot of ethnic Germans. The British and French would enter a quick meeting with Hitler and would allow him to take the land. The Allies hoped that if they could please Hitler enough, he wouldn't begin another world war. But instead of just taking the land given, Hitler would continue into Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia would be forced to surrender, becoming a Slovakia puppet. Next, Germany looked towards Poland and the territory cutting Germany in two. So Hitler would decide to become friendly with the Soviets, who also disliked Poland. They would enter a public non-aggression pact, but secretly, they would also agree to invade Poland together. Although the Allies were scared by the possibility of the Soviets uniting with the Germans, the British and French had to say no to Hitler, who was demanding Polish territory. But still, Germany would invade Poland, and along with that, Britain and France would also declare war on Germany, beginning World War II. The Poles would fight fiercely, but would not stand a chance against the two sides crashing down on them. In the West, the French would do nothing besides a few weak attacks that only ended in failure. So they looked up north, towards Norway. Valuable iron was being exported from neutral Sweden by neutral Norway. If the Allies could get Norway to stop shipping to Germany, Germany would slowly lose the resources needed to fight. Feeling very pressured, Norway would agree to stop sending iron to Germany. Quickly, Hitler gathered his army for a new operation. Germany invaded Denmark, then into Norway. The Allies landed at ports along the coast, but it would be too late. German air would kick them out. Germany's iron supply would now be secured, and after heavy planning, Hitler would invade the Benelux. British and French soldiers would rush to meet them in Belgium. But the French would make a vital mistake, leaving a weak spot in their defense. Hitler would send a big amount of his army to blitzkrieg through that spot, causing the Allies to be trapped at Dunkirk, a bulk of the British soldiers encircled. After capturing 600,000 men in Dunkirk, the Germans would breeze through France, gaining more encirclements and taking Paris, and within a month, France had surrendered. Only a few days after France would collapse, Italy would join the war on the German side, beginning the African front. Rommel would immediately push into Egypt, entering El Alamein. Meanwhile, from Algiers, Germany would conduct a daring operation. With over 10,000 paratroopers, Germany would land into Gibraltar, and within a few days of messy battles, the Germans would take the small but important piece of land. In Egypt, the Axis would continue into Alexandria, advancing until they met the Suez. It would be too defended to be taken, but luckily for the Axis, a new member just decided to join in. Turkey had been struggling on deciding a path to go on. And, like the Germans, the Turkish people were devastated by their loss in the First World War. So, as the events went on, the Turkish people finally became in favor of a fascist-leaning leader. Ties would rapidly boost with mainly the Italians, but also the Germans. And after a quick mobilization and equipment aid from Germany, Turkey would join the war against the Allies. Jordan and Jerusalem would collapse, the British not expecting a Turkish interference. And after a quick siege, the British would lose the Suez Canal. In an instant, aid and trade routes would close, and a bulk of the British Navy would now be trapped inside of the Mediterranean. In the Isles, the British would begin to starve in terms of resources, not having their fast trade routes anymore. But some good things would happen to them as well. In Africa, a few French colonies would revolt against Vichy France, becoming Free France with British help. Although they would lose Cairo, the British would finally find a stable front in Egypt. Even with low supply, they would fend off the Axis forces, who was out in other missions for now. One of those missions being Greece. Italy and Turkey would both invade Greece. The main purpose was to get the Turkish war support up, since it was fairly down. But the war would quickly turn to a stalemate. The Turks and Italians held off. Germany would be disappointed, having to intervene. Hungary was already getting ready to join the Axis, so when Hitler demanded they join, it was no problem. Romania would also be eager to join for protection against the Soviets, who had recently annexed some land from Romania. Bulgaria would be the next to join. Seeing the war was winning, it would be a good opportunity to get revenge on the Allies for World War I. Yugoslavia would be the one to deny joining. Immediately, the Axis would invade and kill Yugoslavia. Germany would now have a clear path to Greece. After a quick trip to Greece, Germany would invade Athens for the Turks. In the Med, the trapped British fleet in there would slowly starve as constant air raids would wear them out, so the Italians could go in for the kill. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the United States would ignore all pleas by the British for aid. They would remain a fully neutral country unless somebody would attack them, which was becoming a real worry as Japan would seem eager to expand in the Pacific. Because of forced trade, Japan would run low on resources needed to keep them going. So they decided to invade China. They would take Manchuria, and after a short period of peace, a scuffle would happen between the Japanese and Chinese again, allowing the Japanese to invade China once again, sweeping through Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, and the capital city of Nanjing. Although the advances were good, the Japanese would not be able to advance further, the Chinese manpower stopping them. As the war in Europe quickly turned to the favor of the Axis, the Japanese would form the formal Axis, with Germany and Italy. After letting Japan occupy French Indochina, the Germans, along with their allies, would begin to build up for a secret invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were in a dire situation. After the death of Lenin, Nikolai Bukharin would beat Stalin in a power struggle to become the next leader of the USSR. After very narrowly avoiding a civil war, Nikolai would begin to implement his new economic policies. These went horribly, since he would try to mix a capitalist policy with the Soviet Union. Famine would occur all over the country for a bunch of reasons, and peasant uprisings would occur daily. The Red Army would be trained for mainly and sometimes only on destroying those uprisings. Nikolai would hold on to his fragile leadership for now, but many were already beginning to turn against him. That's when Germany would hit. With over 3 million men, the Axis would invade the Soviet Union. Quickly, the Germans would advance into the unprepared defenses. The invasion of Russia was Hitler's main goal since the beginning. His hatred for the people there were now being shown in full blast. Minsk would fall with over 400,000 men being encircled. In Kiev, over 700,000 would also get encircled. And in Vyazma, another 600,000 would meet the same fate. All over the front, more hundreds of thousands of men would be trapped and squeezed in on. Spain, seeing the rapid success in Russia and with pressure from the Germans, would finally join the Axis and would send troops to mainly Africa, but also some in Russia. One thing the Germans would realize is that the Soviets had never industrialized properly. Nikolai was dealing with way too many problems to invest into becoming modern. To be fair, they thought they were friendly with the Axis. Also, the United States would not send any aid to the Soviets. That could have held the Germans off. The Americans would insist on their neutrality. Because of these two major problems, the Red Army would continue to get slaughtered. In Leningrad, over 900,000 men would die for the captured city, not counting the civilian casualties. Moscow would be the main focus. Nikolai would be evacuated to Stalingrad, as the Axis forces would rush the capital city. Just as winter would hit, Moscow would fall. For now, the Axis would go on the defense, the Russians bringing in winter specialized units. Meanwhile, Japan was still unsatisfied with their resources and wanted to expand more into Southeast Asia. The only problem was that the powerful United States were in the way. So the Japanese would come up with the idea to destroy their navy before the war even started. So on the 7th of December, the Japanese would raid the Hawaiian port of Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. The first would target anti-air, the battleships, and all of the aircraft carriers. The second would go for the oil reserves, submarine base, and the repair bases. Both waves would be successful. The The United States Navy would be crippled. Allowing the Japanese to go on a rampage, they would force Thailand to join the Axis to invade Malaysia and Burma. They would invade the Philippines and Borneo, the rest of Indonesia, the Solomons' many Pacific islands, and Papua New Guinea. The Japanese victories had been quick and great, showing the Allies another front that they were horribly losing in. Although the Americans were in the worst position for now, they would rebuild their navy slowly. Meanwhile, would send units to Africa and the Isles, planning a future invasion of Europe. Back in Russia, winter has ended, so the Axis went back on the offensive. This time, Hitler had a different plan. Instead of focusing on the center, they would focus on the south. The Germans would breeze through, reaching the Caspian Sea within no time. With Turkish help, the Germans would slowly squeeze the Soviets out of the Caucasus, resulting in another catastrophic encirclement. Stalingrad would be a bloodbath. Axis troops would enter the new capital city and would meet fierce resistance. But ultimately, the Soviets would get kicked out. Nikolai would be kicked out of his leadership after this final loss. The Soviets would try a last attempt to stay together, installing a provisional government. But there was nothing they could do. Many warlords would break away, willing to fight for their freedom. But the Soviets had no more energy to fight. So they would accept their collapse, the Germans advancing until they met their new borders. The Axis would have to set a good amount of their troops stationed in Russia to put down revolts. But besides that, they had just freed up millions of troops. Many would go to Africa, but a majority would go to France for a new operation. Because of the Japanese destroying the American Navy, the British would be forced to thinly stretch their navy out in Europe and Asia. But still, their navy was strong and was not to be played with. The Germans knew this, but still Hitler was thinking about an invasion of Britain. Ireland would decide to help out the Germans, coming to the conclusion that an Axis victory was inevitable. This is what Hitler needed. Hitler would direct most of its air from Russia to Britain, bombing the hell out of the island. Meanwhile, the Allies were distracted by that. The Germans would successfully ship around 100,000 men to Ireland. Seemingly out of nowhere, German and Irish troops would swiftly take Northern Ireland. All four main European Axis fleets would combine to fight for the English Channel. The German air superiority would help tremendously. The tide was quickly turning against the British, and within mere days of fighting for the Channel, Axis forces would make landfall on England. Brilliant tactics made by German generals would allow the Axis to make good strongholds. The royal family and prime minister would be evacuated out of London, as it would be encircled with a large amount of troops in it. Even with American troops on the front line, the Axis would keep a slow but steady advance northward, making Wales and Cornwall puppets. As months would pass, and the Axis would continue their pace, Scotland would eventually declare its independence, taking the opportunity to be its own free nation. Scotland would kick out all of the Allied troops, forcing them to surrender to the Germans. The collapse of the Isles would ripple across the British colonies. Australia would take the chance to declare its independence from Britain, stating that it was for their own safety. They would peace out with Japan. India would take a more bloody route. After the taking of London, riots would break out all over the Raj. Following Australia's moves, India would declare itself a republic as well. They would find a treaty with Japan. Japan gaining Burma, meanwhile, Bengal would gain its independence. Guyana would declare itself a republic as well, along with the rest of the Caribbean. Africa would turn into a mess. Revolts would break out everywhere, and the British would suffer mass deserters. The Axis would overwhelm the Allies in Africa. The Americans would pull out, allowing the Axis to take the entirety of Africa. Making deals with the rebels, a new map of the continent would be born. South Africa would be allowed to become an independent republic, the Germans not wanting to lose more men for no purpose. The Middle East would also shatter, the British losing all of their oil. New Zealand would have daily riots, but would remain loyal to the British for now. But not all was bad. Meanwhile, the British Empire would collapse. The Americans had finally rebuilt their navy in the Pacific. The Americans would begin an island hopping campaign. The Japanese would fight harshly but would be unable to stop their navy. Papua New Guinea would also be retaken. A campaign to retake Indonesia would begin. The Americans would now go for the island of Iwo Jima. They would get lured in by the Japanese. They would engage, beginning the biggest navy battle ever in history. It would result in a slight Japanese victory. The American Navy would once again be crippled, but the Japanese one would be destroyed beyond repair. But even after this loss, American morale was through the roof. Like they did last time, they would begin to repair their navy again, planning another shot at invading the island. But that's when it would happen. On a quiet morning in Pearl Harbor, an unexpected destroyed Japanese fleet would show up, carrying a long-range German bomber. How the Germans possessed this technology before the Americans is still debated. Inside of that bomber would be a nuclear weapon, and at 8 a.m., the Germans would nuke Pearl Harbor. The war was over. The Americans lost all hope within minutes. Even though they were close to nuclear technology themselves, they couldn't risk getting nuked more before they got their own nukes. The Americans would surrender, ending World War II. The Cold War would commence shortly with three sides. Once friendly towards each other, the Japanese and Germans would break all good relations. The Germans, yes, had the best army in the world for now, would have one of the worst economies, bringing Europe down with them. Japan would suffer revolt after revolt in China and other conquered places. It was becoming increasingly hard to put them down. In America, riots would break out after the loss of the war. Many Americans wanted to keep fighting so they could nuke the Germans back. All three superpowers would deal with low stability, entering a new era in the world.